Ethan always felt like the odd one out. His parents were busy with work, and the kids in the neighborhood either ignored him or picked on him. He spent most of his days wandering around the quiet streets of the small town, looking for something, anything that could give him a sense of excitement. That's when he saw it. One late afternoon, while riding his old beat-up scooter, Ethan noticed something strange behind the rusted gates of the abandoned house on the edge of town. The house had been empty for years, its windows boarded up, and its yard overgrown with weeds. Most kids stayed away from it, whispering about curses and ghosts. But Ethan was curious. He stopped at the gate and peered inside. There, half buried under a mess of vines and dirt, was an old bicycle. It didn't look like much at first glance: rusted metal, peeling paint, and two flat tires. But something about it drew Ethan in. It was as if the bike was calling to him. Without thinking twice, he pushed open the creaky gate and made his way into the yard. The air seemed colder the closer he got to the bike. He knelt down and pulled it out from under the vines. His fingers brushed against the metal, and a strange chill ran down his spine. The bike was heavier than it looked, and the worn-out leather seat felt oddly warm, almost like it had been used recently. Ethan knew his parents would freak out if they found out he'd been near the old house, but he couldn't leave the bike there. It felt like it belonged to him now, so with some effort he pushed the bike home, all the while feeling a strange sensation that he wasn't alone. When he got home, Ethan quickly hid the bike in the garage. He spent the next few days secretly working on it. He tightened the chains, replaced the old tires, and scrubbed away the dirt. Slowly, the bicycle started to take shape, transforming into something almost new. But as he worked on it, weird things began to happen. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in strange places. The bike would shift slightly when he wasn't looking, moving from one side of the garage to the other. He shrugged it off at first, thinking he was just tired or imagining things. Finally, the day came when the bike was ready for its first ride. Ethan was excited but also a little nervous. As he sat on the seat and placed his hands on the handlebars, he felt that strange chill again, but he ignored it. With a push, he started riding down the street. At first, everything seemed normal. The bike glided smoothly, faster than he expected for something so old. But soon things started to feel wrong. The bike seemed to have a mind of its own. No matter how hard Ethan tried, he couldn't slow it down. It raced through the streets, weaving through traffic, narrowly avoiding cars. His heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the handlebars, but the bike didn't stop. It was as if it was pulling him somewhere. As he sped down the road, dogs barked and howled, their fur standing on end as if they sensed something evil. People stared, their faces filled with confusion and fear as the bike whizzed by. Finally, the bike slowed down and Ethan was able to stop. His hands were shaking and his legs felt weak. Something wasn't right. He knew this bike was more than just an old piece of metal. But what scared him the most was the feeling that the bike wasn't done with him yet. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a sense of unease. The events from the previous day played on a loop in his mind. The ride had felt too fast, too smooth, and far too strange. But curiosity got the better of him again. He couldn't shake the feeling that the bike was special, that it was his now. He spent more time riding it, testing its speed, and pushing it to its limits. Strangely, every time he rode, the bike seemed to respond to him, almost like it could predict his movements. It was as if it had become an extension of him. No matter how reckless he was, the bike would always stay balanced. It never wobbled, never slipped. In fact, it felt like the bike was making him better, a stronger, faster rider than he ever thought possible. But with each ride, something else grew inside Ethan, a subtle but noticeable change. His mood became darker, and his temper flared easily. When his mom asked him about his day, he snapped at her without knowing why. When kids at school teased him, instead of walking away like he used to, he felt an urge to lash out, to hurt them. He hated the way it made him feel, but the moment he would back on the bike, those dark feelings melted away. One afternoon after school, Ethan found himself riding through the neighborhood again. As he sped past houses, a black car swerved suddenly to avoid hitting him. The driver honked angrily, and Ethan caught a glimpse of the man's furious face as he sped away. But instead of feeling scared or sorry, Ethan smiled. The bike made him feel powerful, invincible. Later that night, as he lay in bed, he thought he heard faint whispers, At first, he ignored them, thinking it was just the wind. But the sound grew louder. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the garage, from the bike. Ethan sat up, listening carefully, but the whispers stopped just as suddenly as they began. His heart raced, and for a moment, he thought about getting up to check the garage. But fear kept him glued to his bed. It was a fear that was different from anything he'd felt before. It was cold, almost suffocating. Over the next few days, the strange events continued. Ethan would find the bike in different spots in the garage, even though he knew exactly where he had left it. Sometimes it would be closer to the door, other times leaning against the wall. His mom even asked him why he kept moving it around, but he didn't know what to say. How could he explain that it wasn't him, that the bike seemed to have a life of its own? As the days passed, Ethan became more isolated. He stopped talking to his parents, avoided his friends, and spent all his free time with the bike. He rode it every day, no matter the weather, no matter how late it got. And every time he climbed onto the seat, the world seemed to disappear, and the dark whispers in his head grew louder. One night as Ethan slept, he had a nightmare. In the dream, he was riding the bike down an endless, dark road. No matter how fast he pedaled, he couldn't stop. The wind howled in his ears, and the sky above him was pitch black. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of him, a shadowy boy with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Ethan tried to steer away, but the bike wouldn't budge. It was taking him straight toward the figure. Just as he was about to collide with the boy, Ethan woke up in a cold sweat. His heart was pounding, and his hands were shaking. He couldn't explain it, but he knew the boy in his dream wasn't just a figment of his imagination. He was real, and somehow he was connected to the bike. The next morning, Ethan went to the garage to check on the bike. It was sitting in its usual spot, looking as harmless as ever. But Ethan knew better now. He knew something was wrong with it, something dark and twisted. And for the first time, he wondered if he should stop riding it. But as he reached for the bike's handlebars, a cold chill ran down his spine. The whispers were back, louder than ever, and this time they were calling his name. Despite the growing unease in his mind, Ethan couldn't resist the pull of the bike. Every time he thought about walking away from it, something inside him tugged him back. It was as if the bike had become a part of him. So one late afternoon, he decided to take it out for another ride, hoping to shake off the strange feelings that had been haunting him. Maybe it was just his imagination running wild, he told himself. Maybe he was overthinking everything. The moment he sat on the seat, the familiar cold sensation crept up his spine again. His fingers tingled as they gripped the handlebars, and the air around him felt heavier than usual. As he started pedaling down the street, the bike felt smoother, faster, almost effortless. It was like the bike wanted him to go faster, urging him forward with every push of the pedals. He glided through the streets, picking up speed without even trying. The wind whipped through his hair, and for a brief moment, he felt a rush of excitement. But that feeling quickly turned to fear when he realized he wasn't controlling the bike anymore. His hands tightened on the handlebars, but they didn't respond. The bike was moving on its own. Ethan tried to steer, to slow down, but it was no use. The bike had taken over, pulling him faster and faster down the narrow streets of the town. His heart pounded in his chest as he flew past houses, streetlights, and people. Everything was a blur. He heard the distant honking of cars, the bark of dogs, but it all seemed muffled, far away, as if the bike was dragging him into a world of its own. Panic set in as the bike took sharp turns without warning, narrowly avoiding collisions with parked cars and mailboxes. Ethan's pulse raced as he desperately tried to regain control, but the bike seemed to have a mind of its own. It swerved and weaved through traffic, faster than any bike he'd ever ridden before. It didn't make sense. This was an old, rusted bike, yet it moved like it was powered by something much more sinister. Suddenly, a car swerved sharply in front of him, the driver blaring the horn in panic. Ethan's heart stopped as the bike shot past, missing the car by mere inches. His breath came in ragged gasps as he realized how close he had come to disaster, but the bike didn't slow down. If anything, it sped up, as if it was enjoying the danger, feeding off his fear. Ethan's eyes darted around, searching for a way to stop, but the pedals were spinning on their own now. His feet no longer touched the ground, and his hands felt frozen to the handlebars. He was trapped, a passenger on his own bike, being taken somewhere he didn't want to go. The bike veered sharply off the main road, heading toward the outskirts of town, where the streets were quieter, the houses more spread out. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. The orange glow of dusk bathed the world in an eerie light, and Ethan felt a chill creep into his bones. As the bike sped further from town, the streets became darker, more desolate. He was heading toward the old forest that bordered the town, the same forest where the boy, Daniel, had disappeared all those years ago. Ethan's mind raced with fear. He didn't want to go there. He had to stop the bike, but his body wouldn't respond. It was like he was being pulled by an invisible force, one that had control over both him and the bike. The trees loomed ahead, their branches casting long skeletal shadows over the road. Ethan's pulse quickened. He could feel the bike pulling him closer, closer to the woods where the shadows seemed to whisper and beckon him deeper into the darkness. The wind howled in his ears, but beneath it, he swore he heard faint voices, whispers, laughter, calling his name. His heart pounded harder, and panic gripped his chest. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The bike carried him forward, straight toward the tree line. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices rising from the depths of the forest, each one calling to him, pulling him in. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the bike stopped. Ethan skidded to a halt at the very edge of the forest. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his hands were shaking uncontrollably. For a moment, the world was silent. The bike stood still beneath him, as if waiting. He looked around, his heart still racing, but there was nothing, just the silent looming trees and the fading light of the setting sun. But Ethan knew. He knew deep down that this wasn't over. The bike had taken him here for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was waiting for him in the darkness of the forest. The whispers had stopped, but the cold chill remained. Ethan dismounted the bike, his legs trembling beneath him, and stepped back slowly. But even as he backed away, he knew that something had followed him out of the woods. Something dark, something ancient, something that was waiting for the right moment to strike. The bike hadn't just taken him for a ride. It had brought him to the edge of something far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. The ride was only the beginning. After that terrifying ride, Ethan didn't touch the bicycle for a few days. Every time he passed the garage, his heart would beat faster, and a cold sweat would break out on his forehead. He couldn't get the memory of the bike's unnatural speed and control out of his mind. Worse still were the whispers, the strange, eerie voices that seemed to follow him even in his dreams. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had latched onto him, something that had come out of the woods with him that evening. At night, his dreams became more vivid, more unsettling. He would find himself riding the bike down long, empty roads that seemed to stretch into infinity, always with something lurking just out of sight. In these dreams, the bike was no longer just a rusty old object. It was alive. Its tires spun on their own, and the handlebars moved with purpose, guiding him towards something sinister waiting in the shadows. The most terrifying part of the dream was the presence of the boy, Daniel. Ethan didn't know how he knew, but the pale figure with hollow eyes that watched him from the edge of the road was definitely Daniel, the boy who had disappeared so many years ago. Daniel's ghostly face would twist into a chilling grin as Ethan rode closer, as if he knew something terrible was about to happen. But the bike didn't just haunt his dreams. During the day, Ethan began to notice changes in himself. His once easygoing, quiet personality was fading. He became irritable, snapping at his parents for no reason. His mother asked if everything was all right, but he brushed her off, too embarrassed and afraid to tell her about the bike. At school, his temper flared whenever someone teased him. A classmate bumped into him in the hallway, and Ethan shoved him hard, harder than he intended. The kid hit the lockers with a loud crash, and everyone stared at Ethan in shock. He didn't feel like himself anymore. It was as if the bike was inside his head, twisting his thoughts, feeding off his anger. But as much as he wanted to avoid it, he couldn't stay away. The bike seemed to call to him, a whisper in the back of his mind that grew louder each day. Finally unable to resist the pull any longer, Ethan found himself back in the garage, standing in front of the bike. It looked harmless, just a rusty old bicycle like before, but Ethan knew better now. There was something inside it, something dark and malevolent. He could feel it watching him, waiting for him to climb back on. With a shaky breath, he reached out and touched the handlebars. The cold metal felt familiar now, almost like it belonged to him. As soon as his fingers wrapped around the grips, the whispers returned, soft and distant at first, but growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just voices anymore, they were commands. "Ride," they whispered. "You must ride." Against his better judgment, Ethan pushed the bike out of the garage and onto the street. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road, and a heavy stillness hung in the air. He mounted the bike, his hands trembling as they gripped the handlebars. The moment he sat down, the whispers stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He began pedaling slowly at first, testing the bike as he rolled down the street. But as he gained speed, the bike seemed to take over again. It moved faster, smoother, with a strange fluidity that felt almost supernatural. This time, Ethan didn't fight it. He let the bike guide him, allowing it to carry him wherever it wanted. The streets were empty as he rode through the quiet town. The houses looked darker than usual, their windows like black, hollow eyes watching him pass by. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, the whispers were clearer, more distinct. "Keep going," they urged. "You're almost there." Almost where's, yeah, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't stop. His hands were glued to the handlebars, his feet pedaling faster and faster, even though his mind screamed at him to turn back. The bike was in control now, pulling him towards something unseen, something terrible. The road stretched out before him, leading him away from the familiar streets of the town and into the woods. The same woods where Daniel had disappeared. Ethan's stomach twisted with fear as the trees loomed closer. The last time he had come near the forest, he had barely managed to escape, but this time there was no turning back. As he rode deeper into the woods, the bike seemed to grow even faster, its wheels spinning like they were possessed by some otherworldly force. The trees blurred around him, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers, trying to grab him, to pull him in. Suddenly, the path split. One road led deeper into the forest where darkness swallowed the trees whole. The other led back toward town. For a brief moment, Ethan thought he could choose, thought he could force the bike to turn back. But the bike had already made its choice. It veered sharply toward the dark path, dragging Ethan with it. As they plunged into the shadows, the whispers grew louder, echoing all around him. The wind whipped through the trees and howling in his ears, and the ground beneath him seemed to shake with every turn of the wheels. Ethan's heart raced, fear gripping him as the bike pulled him deeper, deeper into the woods, into the heart of the darkness. The bike wasn't just taking him for a ride, it was taking him to something, something that had been waiting for him all along. As Ethan plunged deeper into the heart of the forest, the world around him seemed to warp. The trees twisted into strange, unnatural shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, as if they were alive and watching. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence replaced the sounds of the wind and birds. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Ethan's hands gripped the handlebars tightly, but no matter how hard he tried to stop, the bike wouldn't listen. His feet pedaled without his control, the wheels turning faster and faster, as if the bike was determined to reach some unknown destination. The fear that had gnawed at him earlier now gripped him fully. The whispers had returned, louder than before, surrounding him like a chorus of voices, each one calling his name, each one urging him onward. His vision blurred as the bike sped through the winding path, weaving between the trees with unnatural precision. The world around him seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening, stretching toward him. Panic bubbled up inside him, and for a moment he thought he saw movement in the trees, dark figures lurking just beyond his line of sight, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the bike veered off the path and into the thick undergrowth. Ethan's heart pounded as he was jerked through the bushes and low-hanging branches. The bike moving as if it knew exactly where it was going. The whispers became more urgent, more insistent, filling his mind with a growing sense of dread. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the bike skidded to a stop. Ethan blinked, his heart still racing as he looked around. He was in a small, dark clearing deep in the woods. The trees loomed tall around him, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the remaining light of the setting sun. In the center of the clearing, half buried in the ground, was something that made Ethan's blood run cold. It was another bicycle, rusted, broken, and twisted beyond recognition. But it wasn't just any bike. Ethan knew deep down that this was Daniel's bike, the one the boy had been riding when he disappeared all those years ago. The whispers that had been surrounding him fell silent, leaving an oppressive stillness in the air. Ethan tried to move, tried to get off his bike and run, but his body wouldn't listen. His hands remained glued to the handlebars, his legs frozen in place. A sense of dread settled over him as he realized the bike wasn't finished with him yet. It had brought him here for a reason. The air grew colder, and Ethan could feel something watching him. Slowly, almost unwillingly, his eyes drifted toward the edge of the clearing. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was a Daniel. But it wasn't the boy he had seen in his dreams. This Daniel was different. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. His clothes were tattered, covered in dirt and leaves, and his lips were twisted into a cruel, unnatural smile. Daniel's eyes locked onto Ethan's, and in that moment, Ethan knew that whatever stood before him wasn't human anymore. Daniel stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear that radiated off Ethan. The whispers returned, but now they were coming from Daniel's direction, echoing in Ethan's mind with a bone-chilling clarity. "You're next," the voices whispered, overlapping in a cacophony of malice. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as Daniel moved closer, his steps slow but unrelenting. Every instinct in Ethan's body screamed at him to run, to escape, but the bike held him in place. His muscles were locked, frozen in place by some unseen force. The cold metal of the handlebars bit into his palms, and he felt the familiar chill of the bike's unnatural power coursing through him. As Daniel drew nearer, Ethan saw something glinting in his hand, a small, rusted bell, the kind that once hung from the handlebars of a child's bike. With a sickening realization, Ethan knew that the bell belonged to Daniel's old bike. It was the last piece, the final connection that bound Daniel to the bicycle and to the dark force that now controlled both of them. Daniel stopped in front of Ethan, his hollow eyes boring into him, and slowly he raised the bell to his lips. The sound that followed was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard, a high-pitched, otherworldly ringing that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. The ground beneath Ethan's feet trembled, and the shadows in the clearing began to move, swirling around them like a living, breathing entity. The bike beneath Ethan shuddered violently, and before he could react, the front wheel turned sharply on its own. With a jolt, the bike launched forward, throwing Ethan toward the broken, rusted remains of Daniel's bike. He tumbled to the ground, his body hitting the earth with a sickening thud. Dazed, Ethan struggled to push himself up, but the moment he lifted his head, he realized the horrifying truth. His bike, the one he had thought was his, was merging with Daniel's. The rusted metal twisted and fused together, the once broken frame becoming whole again. The wheels spun slowly, creaking as they came to life. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he watched in horror. The bike was no longer just an object. It had become something more, something alive, and it wanted him. With a deafening screech, the bike's wheels turned toward him, its handlebars jerking violently in his direction. The force that had held him frozen now pulled him toward the bike, dragging him across the ground. He clawed at the dirt, desperately trying to escape, but it was no use. The last thing Ethan saw before the darkness consumed him was Daniel's twisted grin, the bell still clutched in his hand as the bike enveloped him in its cold, metallic embrace. The forest fell silent once more, the clearing empty except for the newly restored bike, its tires wet with mud. The whispers faded into the wind, and the trees seemed to sigh as if satisfied. Ethan was gone, and the bicycle's voice was waiting for its next rider. The next morning, the town woke up to the quiet realization that Ethan was missing. His parents called the police and search parties combed the streets, but no one had seen or heard from him since the previous evening. The only clue was his empty bed and the garage door left slightly ajar. The bicycle, which Ethan had been so fixated on, was nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks, and hope of finding Ethan alive began to fade. The search was eventually called off, and the town fell back into its usual rhythm. But rumors started to spread. Some kids claimed they had seen Ethan riding his bike near the edge of the woods, but when they got close, he and the bike vanished into thin air. Others whispered about the eerie feeling that seemed to settle over the town after Ethan's disappearance, like a shadow hanging in the air. As weeks passed, the whispers about Ethan's bike grew quieter, fading into the background like an old legend. But then something strange happened. One misty evening, as the sun began to set, a young boy named Jack was walking home from school. He lived near the outskirts of town, close to the old woods. Jack had always been a curious kid, the kind who liked to explore and wander off the beaten path. That night, as he cut through a narrow alley behind his house, something caught his eye. There, leaning against a tree at the edge of the woods, was an old bicycle. It was rusted and worn, its paint chipped and faded. The bike looked out of place, almost like it had been left there on purpose. Jack stared at it for a moment, a strange feeling creeping up his spine. It reminded him of the stories he had overheard, the ones about Ethan and the mysterious bike that had led to his disappearance. Despite the unease curling in his stomach, Jack felt an odd pull toward the bike. He knew he should turn around and go home, but something deep inside him, some mix of curiosity and recklessness, made him take a step closer. The air around the bike seemed colder, heavier. And as Jack reached out to touch the handlebars, a gust of wind whispered through the trees, as if urging him on. His fingers grazed the cold metal, and immediately a chill shot through his entire body. Jack shivered, his hand jerking back in the instinct, but his eyes remained locked on the bike. It didn't feel like just an ordinary bike. It felt alive. For a moment, Jack stood frozen, torn between the growing sense of dread in his chest and the strange magnetic pull of the bike. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the ground, and the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees. Somewhere in the distance, Jack thought he heard a faint sound, almost like a bell ringing. And then it happened. The bike moved. It was subtle at first, just a small creak as the front wheel shifted slightly to the side. Jack's breath caught in his throat, his heart racing as he stepped back. But before he could run, the bike rolled forward, its wheels turning slowly, deliberately, like it was testing the ground. Jack's eyes widened in horror as the bike came to life before him, moving on its own, inching closer with each passing second. His instincts screamed at him to turn and run, but his feet felt glued to the ground, as if the bike's presence had rooted him in place. The front wheel turned, and the bike's handlebars twisted toward him, as if inviting him to take a ride. The faint ringing of the bell echoed again, and this time it was louder. Closer, Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but despite the terror flooding his mind, he found himself stepping forward, reaching out for the bike. His fingers gripped the handlebars, and the moment he touched them, the whispers began. They were faint at first, soft voices that seemed to rise from the wind, but soon they grew louder, more insistent, wrapping around Jack's thoughts like a vice. He tried to let go of the bike, but his hands wouldn't obey. His fingers tightened around the grips, and he felt the familiar cold seep into his skin. Without thinking, Jack climbed onto the seat. The moment he did, the bike sprang to life. It shot forward, faster than any bike Jack had ever ridden. His legs pedaled without his control, and the wind whipped through his hair as the world around him blurred into a rush of dark trees and shadows. His heart raced, panic gripping him as the bike sped faster and faster, taking him down a narrow path that led straight into the woods. The trees closed in around him, their branches reaching out like claws, and the whispers grew louder, echoing all around him. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop the bike. It was like the handlebars were welded to his hands, forcing him forward, deeper into the dark. Just when he thought he couldn't bear the terror any longer, the bike skidded to a stop. Jack looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. He was in a clearing, surrounded by trees. The air was heavy, and the silence pressed in on him from all sides. The bike stood still beneath him, but Jack knew something was horribly wrong. And then he saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing was Ethan. His clothes were torn and dirty, his skin pale and ghostly. But it was his eyes that sent chills down Jack's demolon, those hollow, empty eyes that stared back at him without emotion. Ethan's lips twisted into a cold, cruel smile, and Jack felt the blood drain from his face. Before Jack could react, the bike began to move again. It pulled him forward, dragging him toward Ethan, toward the darkness that waited beyond the clearing. The last thing Jack saw before the world went black was Ethan stepping aside, allowing the bike to pull him deeper into the forest, into the same fate that had claimed so many before him. The clearing fell silent once more. The bike remained, its wheels slowly coming to a stop. And in the distance, the faint sound of a bell rang through the trees. It wouldn't be long before the bike found its next rider. In the days following Jack's disappearance, the town buzzed with fear and confusion. Another boy had gone missing, just like Ethan, without a single trace. The town's quiet streets, once filled with the laughter of children, were now steeped in a tense silence. Parents kept their children indoors, afraid to let them venture near the woods. Whispers of the haunted bicycle spread like wildfire, and although no one dared to speak of it openly, everyone knew something terrible was happening. Jack's parents were inconsolable, devastated by their son's sudden disappearance. The search parties were organized again, combing the woods, the streets, and every forgotten corner of the town. But just like with Ethan, there was no sign of Jack. No clues, no footprints, and no bike. The town fell under a cloud of dread. People began to remember the old stories, the ones they had dismissed as mere legends. Stories of cursed objects, of things that didn't belong to the living world, but somehow found their way back to it. And in the back of everyone's mind, there was the growing realization that the bicycle was more than just a bike. It was a curse, one that would never stop. One foggy morning, a young girl named Sarah was walking along the quiet road near the edge of town. The mist hung heavy in the air, and the world around her seemed muted, the sounds of the town distant and far away. She was on her way to visit her grandmother, and although she had heard the stories about the disappearances, she wasn't afraid. After all, she didn't go near the woods. She stayed on the safe roads, the ones her parents had warned her to stick to. But as she turned the corner near the abandoned old house at the edge of the town, she saw something strange. A bicycle. It was leaning against a tree, half hidden in the mist. Sarah paused, her heart skipping a beat. It was an old bike, rusted and worn, with faded paint and a crooked handlebar. She had heard about Ethan's and Jack's disappearances, but she had never believed in the supernatural whispers that had spread through the town. Still, something about the bike felt off. Curiosity tugged at her, the same curiosity that had led Ethan and Jack to their fates. Sarah hesitated for a moment, torn between the instinct to turn around and the strange pull that seemed to come from the bike itself. The air around her felt heavier, colder, and for a split second she thought she heard a soft ringing sound, like a bell chiming in the distance. She took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. The bike seemed harmless, just an old piece of junk left behind by someone who no longer needed it. But the longer she stared at it, the stronger the feeling grew that it wasn't just an ordinary bike. Her fingers twitched at her side. She could walk away. She could leave the bike behind, tell herself it was just a coincidence, just an abandoned object left to rot. But her feet moved forward on their own, and before she knew it, she was standing right next to the bike, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Sarah reached out, her hand trembling slightly as it hovered over the handlebars. The moment her fingers brushed the cold, rusted metal, a wave of nausea washed over her. The air around her seemed to hum with a strange, oppressive energy, and for a moment, she thought she could hear faint whispers, like the wind speaking directly into her ear. "Ride," the voices urged softly, barely above a whisper. Just one ride. Her heart raced, but her hand was already gripping the handlebars. The chill from the metal seeped into her skin, and the whispers grew louder, filling her mind with a mix of fear and strange excitement. She knew she shouldn't. She knew the stories, the warnings, but there was something else now, a deep, primal need to ride the bike, to see where it would take her. Slowly, as if in a trance, Sarah mounted the bike. The seat felt cold and worn, and the bike creaked slightly as she shifted her weight. She placed her feet on the pedals, her hands gripping the handlebars tightly. The world around her seemed to hold its breath, the mist swirling in strange patterns at her feet. And then, the bike moved. It was subtle at first, just a small push, but then it sped up, faster and faster, until the road beneath her blurred into a mix of gray and white. The mist swallowed everything around her, and for a moment, she felt weightless, as if she was flying through a dream. But the dream quickly turned into a nightmare. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her head with voices that weren't her own. The bike moved on its own, pulling her down roads she didn't recognize, weaving through the fog as if it knew exactly where to go. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her fear growing with every passing second. She tried to stop, to slow down, but the bike wouldn't listen. It took sharp turns through the dense fog, heading straight for the woods. The same woods where Ethan and Jack had vanished. The trees loomed ahead, their twisted branches like dark fingers reaching out to grab her. Sarah's pulse quickened, her breath coming in short gasps as the bike plunged into the forest without hesitation. The whispers became screams. The bike veered deeper into the woods, past twisted trees and dark shadows that seemed to move just out of sight. Sarah's mind raced with fear, her hands glued to the handlebars, unable to let go. The cold, dead air pressed in on her, and she could feel the presence of something watching her, something dark and ancient, hidden within the woods. Suddenly, the bike skidded to a halt, throwing Sarah off balance. She stumbled off the bike, her legs shaky and weak, and found herself standing in a familiar clearing. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw it, the same clearing where Ethan and Jack had disappeared. And standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, were two figures, Ethan and Jack. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They watched her with a strange, eerie stillness, their bodies unnaturally stiff. But it was the smile that sent chills down her spine, the twisted, cruel smile that mirrored the one Ethan had given Jack before his final ride. The bike behind her creaked ominously, its wheels turning slowly as if waiting for her to climb back on. Sarah turned to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The whispers returned, louder now, filling her mind with their sinister chant. "Ride," they hissed. "It's your turn." The last thing Sarah saw before the world went black was Ethan and Jack, their hollow eyes watching her as the shadows closed in around her. The bike stood still in the clearing, its frame rusted and old, waiting patiently for its next rider. The curse wasn't finished. It never would be. The news of Sarah's disappearance shook the town to its core. 3 children gone, all under mysterious circumstances, and all linked by the same eerie location, the woods at the edge of town. Rumors swirled like wildfire, but the police had no answers. The town's residents were gripped by fear, and parents forbade their children from going anywhere near the forest. The once lively streets fell eerily silent, and an unsettling tension hung in the air, thick like a fog that refused to lift. But despite the warnings, the story of the haunted bicycle grew stronger in the town's whispers. Some dismissed it as urban legend, a tale told to scare kids into staying safe. Others believed in the curse, an evil force that had claimed Ethan, Jack, and now Sarah. Yet no one dared to go looking for the bike, except for Liam, Sarah's older brother. Liam had always been the skeptical type. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses, and he refused to accept that his sister had simply disappeared into thin air. He was determined to find out the truth, no matter how frightening it was. Late one evening, after his parents had fallen asleep, he grabbed a flashlight, pulled on his jacket, and set out for the woods. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet streets as Liam made his way toward the forest. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves made him glance over his shoulder. But he pushed forward, his heart heavy with both fear and determination. He had to find out what had happened to Sarah. As he approached the edge of the woods, he spotted something in the distance, a faint metallic glint among the trees. His breath caught in his throat as he realized what it was, the bicycle. It stood there, leaning against a tree, just like before, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Its rusted frame and crooked handlebars gleamed faintly in the moonlight, and a cold shiver ran down Liam's spine. For a moment he thought about turning back, but the thought of his sister spurred him on. If there was any chance Sarah was still alive, he had to take it. Liam stepped closer, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The bike looked just as the rumors had described, old, worn, and menacing. But as he reached out to touch the handlebars, something strange happened. The air around him grew colder, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. The whispers began. They were soft at first, barely audible over the rustling leaves, but soon they grew louder, filling his ears with voices that didn't belong to the world of the living. "Liam," the voices called, drawing him in. "Come ride with us." His hand hovered over the handlebars, his fingers trembling. He could feel the bike pulling at him, like an invisible force urging him to mount it, to take that first ride. But something deep inside Liam screamed at him to stop, to turn around and leave before it was too late. He stepped back, shaking his head. He wouldn't fall for it. He wouldn't let the bike control him like it had controlled the others. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. Movement in the trees. Two figures stepped out from the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Liam's heart raced as he recognized them from the missing posters that had been plastered around town. But they weren't the same boys anymore. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty, and their bodies moved stiffly, as if they were puppets on invisible strings. And behind them, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was Sarah. Liam's breath caught in his throat. She looked different, her skin pale like the others, her once lively eyes now hollow and lifeless. But it was her, his sister. She stepped forward, her movements slow and unnatural, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "Liam," she whispered, her voice soft and haunting. "Come with us." He wanted to run, to turn and sprint as far away from the forest as possible, but his feet felt glued to the ground. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a dark cloud, and the bike seemed to move on its own, inching closer, its wheels creaking softly. Liam's hands shook, his mind racing with fear. He knew what had happened. He understood now. The bike wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, bound to an evil force that claimed anyone who rode it. It had taken Ethan, Jack, and Sarah, and now it wanted him. But Liam wasn't going to let that happen. Summoning every ounce of strength, he turned and ran. The forest seemed to close in around him as he sprinted through the trees, the voices chasing after him, calling his name. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Behind him, he could hear the faint sound of the bicycle's wheels turning, the soft chime of the bell echoing through the trees. It was coming for him. Liam burst out of the forest and onto the street, his legs burning from the effort. He didn't stop running until he reached his house, slamming the door behind him and collapsing on the floor, gasping for breath. For a moment, the world was silent. The whispers were gone and the bike was nowhere to be seen. But deep down, Liam knew the curse wasn't over. The bike was still out there, waiting for its next victim. And it wouldn't stop until it had claimed them all. A few days later, another child from the town went missing. And there, on the outskirts of the forest, stood the bicycle, rusted and waiting, ready to begin its next ride. The curse of the haunted wheels would never end. Not until every soul in the town had been claimed. The town fell into a state of despair. After Liam's narrow escape, no one doubted the truth anymore. The stories that had once been dismissed as myths now loomed over everyone like a dark shadow. Whispers of the cursed bicycle filled the streets, and parents no longer let their children outside unsupervised. The local authorities ramped up their patrols near the woods, but it did little to ease the fear that gripped the town. People began to abandon their homes near the forest, moving further away from the haunted trees that seemed to harbor the malevolent force. But despite their best efforts to stay safe, the disappearances continued. It didn't matter how far they moved or how many precautions they took. Every few weeks, a new child would vanish, and the cursed bicycle would be spotted once more, lurking on the edge of the woods, waiting. The pattern was always the same. A child would see the bike, be drawn to it by some unseen force, and within days they'd be gone, swallowed by the curse. The bicycle had claimed so many victims by now that people started to believe the entire town was cursed. Businesses closed down, schools emptied out, and houses near the woods stood abandoned, their windows dark and lifeless. The town was dying and the curse was growing stronger. One foggy evening, a boy named Tommy who had heard all the stories and warnings, found himself walking home from a friend's house. His parents had always been overprotective, warning him about the woods, about the disappearances, and about the cursed bicycle. But Tommy had never believed in those tales. To him, it was just superstition, something parents told their kids to keep them from wandering off. As he walked, the mist grew thicker, wrapping around him like a blanket of fog. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows on the road. Tommy quickened his pace, feeling a sudden chill in the air. And then, just up ahead, he saw it. Leaning against a tree at the edge of the woods was the bicycle. Tommy's heart skipped a beat as his eyes locked onto it. It looked exactly like the one from the stories, rusted, old, and out of place. For a moment he froze, his mind racing with fear. The tales of the cursed bike echoed in his head, the stories of children vanishing, never to be seen again. But there was something about the bike that intrigued him. He had always prided himself on being the brave one, the skeptic. Maybe the bike wasn't cursed at all. Maybe it was just an old, forgotten piece of junk left behind by someone years ago. Still, as he took a step closer, a strange sensation washed over him. The air felt colder, and the world around him seemed to fade away, leaving only the bike in his line of sight. His feet moved forward, almost of their own accord, as if drawn by an invisible force. The whispers began, soft at first, but growing louder with each step he took. Ride, Bayron. Shashan. They urged it began. So all he bows? Take what round. Tommy's hand reached out, and his fingers grazed the handlebars. The metal was cold, almost unnaturally so, and the moment he touched it, a shiver ran down his spine. The whispers grew louder, swirling in his mind, and for a brief moment, he thought about turning around, about running home to his parents. But the bike was already in control. Without realizing what he was doing, Tommy swung his leg over the seat and sat down. The world seemed to hold its breath as he placed his feet on the pedals. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind screaming at him to stop, but his body refused to listen. The bike moved. It started slow, but within moments it picked up speed, gliding effortlessly down the mist-covered road. The wind whipped through Tommy's hair, and the trees blurred around him. He tried to steer, to slow down, but the bike had a mind of its own. His hands gripped the handlebars tightly, but they wouldn't respond to his commands. The bike was in control now. Faster and faster it went, pulling him toward the woods, toward the darkness that awaited him. The mist grew thicker, swallowing the road, and the whispers grew louder, filling his ears with their sinister chant. Ride, keep riding. The trees loomed ahead, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows on the ground. The bike veered off the road and onto the narrow path that led into the heart of the forest. Tommy's heart raced, panic gripping him as the bike plunged deeper into the woods. He tried to scream, but the wind stole his voice, leaving him in terrified silence. As the bike sped down the dark path, Tommy saw the clearing up ahead. The same clearing where Ethan, Jack, Sarah, and so many others had disappeared. His breath caught in his throat, and his stomach twisted with fear. He knew what was waiting for him there. The bike screeched to a halt at the edge of the clearing, throwing Tommy off balance. He stumbled to the ground, his hands scraping against the dirt as he tried to steady himself. The whispers had stopped, and the air around him was deathly still. Slowly, Tommy looked up. Standing at the center of the clearing were the figures of all the children who had vanished: Ethan, Jack, Sarah, and the others. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow and empty, just like the stories had said. They watched him with an eerie stillness, their bodies stiff and unmoving. And then he saw it, the bicycle. It stood behind them, its frame gleaming faintly in the dim light. The same rusted bike that had led so many children to their doom. The children's heads turned slowly, their eyes locking onto Tommy. A twisted smile spread across their faces as they stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, backing away from the advancing figures. But there was nowhere to run. The bike was waiting for him. Its wheels began to turn slowly, creaking with each rotation, as if inviting him back onto the seat. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling his mind with their dark commands. Ride, ride. Tommy's feet felt rooted to the ground, his body frozen with fear. He wanted to run, to escape, but he couldn't move. The figures closed in around him, their cold, lifeless eyes watching him with cruel intent. And then, just as Ethan had done before, the figures parted, revealing the bicycle. The clearing fell silent, and the bike stood there, waiting. The cycle of doom was unbreakable. Tommy's fate was sealed. The last thing he saw before the shadows consumed him was the twisted grin on Ethan's face and the sound of the bicycle's wheels turning, echoing through the forest like a death knell. The bike would wait for its next rider, and the curse would live on. The town slowly decayed into a shell of its former self, haunted by the disappearances and the legend of the cursed bicycle. Few dared to remain, and those who did lived in constant fear, knowing the bike still roamed the edges of the woods, waiting patiently for its next victim. And one day it would ride again. No one could escape the haunted wheels of doom.